Hello, my friends. In the aftermath of Steve Witt's visit to Moscow to sit down with Vladimir Putin, a lot of people in the West are obsessively asking one shallow question. What happened? What did they agree to? They watch the smiling footage, the strolls through the city, the body language, hoping for some media-friendly breakthrough they can spin. And when no dramatic announcement appears, they rush to declare the meeting a failure or a waste of time. That is how a declining empire thinks about diplomacy, only as theater. But from a strategic perspective, the signal is entirely different. The United States, through this visit, silently admitted that it has to talk to Moscow, on Moscow's ground and on Moscow's terms. That alone tells you where the leverage now lies. For almost 2 weeks, Western elites have been obsessing over plans. A 28-point plan, a 24-point plan, a 19-point plan, like they're haggling over a corporate merger, not facing the reality of a war they are losing by proxy. They tinker with point lists and communiques, while the only points that matter are being made by Russian artillery, drones, and armored formations along a front that is slowly but relentlessly moving westward. The fundamental illusion behind all these schemes is the fantasy of a just and lasting peace, defined in Kyiv and rubber-stamped in Brussels and Washington. That fantasy has finally collided with the hard granite of reality. The truth is simple, and for Western policymakers, deeply uncomfortable. There is no just peace for Ukraine as they define it. There is no outcome in which Kyiv gets to claim victory, restore 1,991 borders, join NATO, and somehow humiliate Moscow without consequence. That world never existed except in their own propaganda. What the last months have exposed is that any settlement will be unfair in Western eyes because it reflects something they thought they had banished from history. The raw fact that power, not slogans, decides borders. For decades, the West convinced itself that its version of the rules-based international order was permanent, that if you repeat it enough times, that territorial integrity is sacred. It would magically hold, never mind Iraq, Serbia, Libya, Syria. They believed history had ended. That force was only legitimate when they used it. Now they are discovering in Ukraine that the old world never died. Power blocks still clash. Industrial capacity still matters. Demography still matters. The side that can produce artillery shells, drones, armored vehicles, and trained manpower at scale will decide what the map looks like. And on all of those metrics, Russia is winning. Look at the trajectory. When Trump met Putin in Anchorage back in August, Western media breathlessly speculated about big progress. There was talk of a trilateral summit. Trump, Zelensky, Putin. There was chatter about imminent breakthroughs and staged handshake photo ops. None of it materialized. While they were telling fairy tales on TV, the Russian military was grinding down Ukrainian forces in city after city. Pivotal urban centers that once anchored Ukrainian defense lines, places like Avdiivka, fortified for years, have fallen. Kupiansk and other key sectors have been turned into meat grinders. The heroic narratives collapsed against an opponent that would not run out of shells, drones, or patience. Today, we see the strategic consequence of that battlefield reality. Cities that were once firmly under Kyiv's control have been effectively lost. Sister cities are under encirclement or at risk of it. The front is no longer a stable stalemate. It shows all the signs of a slow motion unraveling from the Ukrainian side. This is not just a war of attrition in some abstract sense. It is a structured collapse. Ammunition shortages, exhausted manpower, collapsing morale, and a political class in Kyiv consumed by corruption scandals and internal power plays as the state they preside over bleeds men and territory. Against that backdrop, listen to how Kyiv publicly talks. They stand at podiums and declare their red lines. No legal recognition of Russian control over any territory, no restrictions on Ukraine's armed forces, no veto over alliances, nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. It is the rhetoric of a victor coming to dictate terms spoken by a government whose army is steadily losing ground. It is maximalism without power behind it. In private, Ukrainian negotiators are more flexible because they know the front is deteriorating. But in public, they are trapped because for 2 years they fed their population the lie that compromise was treason and that Western support guaranteed ultimate victory. On the other side, Russia's position has been strikingly consistent since June 2024. Moscow has spelled out its minimum conditions clearly. No NATO membership for Ukraine. Neutral status anchored in formal commitments. Demilitarization, meaning removal or limitation of systems that threaten Russian territory. Denazification protection for Russian language, the Orthodox Church, and Russian-speaking minorities. Recognition of Russian sovereignty over the 4 new regions: Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. These are not bargaining chips. They are the baseline. Russia believes it can secure them by force of arms if necessary, and the battlefield trends support that assessment. Putin has no reason to abandon these objectives when his forces are advancing and the other side is running out of everything that matters. Western commentators like to imagine that there is flexibility on the new Russian territories, that Moscow might trade parts of Kherson or Zaporozhye. Russian officials, however, have repeatedly stated in public that all 4 regions are fully part of the Russian Federation. Those who choose to ignore that are not doing geopolitics. They are doing wishful thinking. The underlying asymmetry is brutal. Russia can continue this war for years if needed. Its economy has adapted to sanctions. Its defense industry has shifted to wartime footing. Its society has accepted the costs. Ukraine cannot. It is bleeding people at a rate it cannot replace, losing its industrial heartland, watching millions of its citizens leave, and relying on foreign money that is increasingly reluctant and conditional. The West, too, has limits. NATO stockpiles are depleted. Defense industries in Europe and the U.S. are struggling to ramp up. There is no political appetite for open NATO-Russia confrontation. Sanctions have failed to break Russia. Instead, they have exposed Europe's dependence on Russian energy and raw materials and driven Moscow closer to non-Western partners. This is why the notion that Washington can simply impose its will on Russia is fantasy. The United States has almost no effective leverage over Moscow. It tried economic sticks, sanctions, asset freezes, financial blacklisting. Russia absorbed the hit, reoriented trade, and kept fighting. It tried military sticks, feeding Ukraine advanced systems, intelligence, advisors. Russia adjusted tactics, adapted its EW and air defense, and continued pushing the front line west. Propaganda and diplomatic isolation failed as well. Much of the global south has no interest in joining an anti-Russian crusade led by the same powers that destroyed Iraq and Libya. Where Washington does have leverage is over Kyiv. Ukraine depends heavily on U.S. weapons, funding, training, and intelligence. Yet even here, that leverage is not infinite. Over time, Ukraine has built modest domestic production capacity. Europe can fill certain gaps, and a Ukrainian leadership cornered by an unacceptable deal might choose political survival over strategic logic and try to keep fighting, even if only temporarily. History is full of leaders who ordered doomed offensives for domestic reasons. That is why any real settlement will have to be seen inside Ukraine as having been forced on Kyiv by the West, so that Ukrainian leaders can later say, "We had no choice. They betrayed us," and shift the blame externally. Russia understands that. It is not enough for Moscow to sign a deal with one Ukrainian president. That deal must be structured so that it survives changes in Kyiv. The fear in Moscow is simple. If a Ukrainian leader accepts painful concessions and is immediately removed, there is no guarantee that any successor will honor the agreement. So Russia has every incentive to ensure that when a deal comes, it is backed by structural guarantees that cannot be easily reversed. Neutrality written into Ukraine's constitutional and treaty framework, hard limits on the types and ranges of weapons deployed, and a clear recognition of changed borders embedded in wider European security arrangements. Europe, meanwhile, continues to live in denial. It responded to the U.S. 28-point plan with its own 24-point plan, an exercise in self-deception that imagined Russia agreeing to conditions that ignore its battlefield advantage and security concerns. European leaders cling to the phrase just and lasting peace as if repetition could conjure it into existence. They insist on not talking to Russia, as though refusing dialogue with the largest military power on their border were some kind of moral virtue rather than geopolitical suicide. The reality is that Europe has marginal influence over the endgame. The US and Russia will shape the outline. Europe can either adapt to that or become a spectator in its own neighborhood. A few voices in Europe at least acknowledge the truth. Figures like Finland's Alexander Stubb openly admit there will be no fair peace for Ukraine, only an unfair one that reflects power realities. That is exactly what the last rounds of diplomacy have exposed. This conflict cannot end in a Ukrainian victory, and it cannot be resolved on the basis of Western slogans. It will end when the West stops fantasizing and starts dealing with Russia as it is, not as they wish it to be. What, then, can the United States still do? It cannot force Russia to retreat. It cannot sustain Ukraine indefinitely at current levels. But it does hold something Moscow cares about: political and economic normalization. Russia can, if it desires, push farther militarily, take more territory, impose harsher terms, deepen Ukraine's disintegration. Yet that alone will not give Moscow what it ultimately seeks: a secure Western frontier, an end to NATO expansion, a stable European security architecture that recognizes Russian interests, and a relaxation of sanctions. If Washington simply walks away and lets Russia and Ukraine fight to the bitter end, Moscow could achieve maximal land gains but remain locked in a frozen confrontation with the West. Sanctions intact, diplomatic relations stagnant. That is where the only real American leverage lies, not in threats but in incentives. Instead of waving sticks that no longer bite, Washington could present a time-limited package: recognition of Ukrainian neutrality and permanent non-alignment, withdrawal of NATO membership offers, structured sanctions relief, and a framework for re-engaging Russia within a new European security arrangement. The message would be, if you are prepared to settle within a defined window, these political and economic benefits are on the table. If you choose to keep fighting indefinitely, they may never be. For Putin, that would force a calculation between territorial maximalism and strategic normalization. Russia does not need the whole of Ukraine to secure its vital interests. It needs a neutral neighbor instead of a NATO forward base, secure control of Crimea and the 4 new regions, verifiable limits on Western weapons deployed in Ukraine, recognition that NATO will not move further east. Those objectives can be achieved with less than total conquest. The question is not whether Russia can win militarily. It can. The question is when it decides that the extra territory gained is no longer worth the additional blood and delay in consolidating its wider strategic position. A serious U.S. offer structured as time-limited carrots rather than toothless sticks could accelerate that decision point. The predictable objection in Western capitals is that this would reward aggression. That objection ignores what Russia has already paid: tens of thousands of casualties, enormous expenditures of munitions, deep restructuring of its economy, enduring a full-spectrum confrontation with NATO. It also ignores that, despite these costs, Russia has emerged more sovereign, less dependent on the West, and more integrated with the non-Western world. Europe, by contrast, has crippled its own energy security, deindustrialized sections of its economy, and exposed the hollowness of its military power. The United States has burned through stockpiles and credibility. If anyone has paid a strategic price for years of miscalculation, it is the West. The war could have been avoided. There were countless diplomatic off-ramps before 2022 on NATO expansion, on Donbass autonomy, on Minsk implementation that Western leaders ignored or sabotaged. They chose escalation and now complain that the resulting settlement is ugly. But we are far past the point where moralizing can substitute for strategy. The reality is simple. Russia has won the decisive contest. Ukraine's best-case future is as a smaller, neutral state with restricted military capabilities and a heavily constrained foreign policy, all guaranteed by the same Western powers that helped push it into this disaster. We are now entering the endgame. This is not a conflict that will drag on for a decade at current intensity. The front is too fragile, Ukraine's resources too depleted, Western patience too thin. Through this winter, Russia will continue to shape the battlefield, attriting the Ukrainian military further, pressing in key sectors. By spring, if current trends hold, it will be on the verge of securing its remaining territorial objectives in Donetsk and consolidating control elsewhere. At that point, Kyiv's position will be even weaker than it is today. Every month of delay now reduces Ukraine's leverage later. In the end, a deal will come when three conditions align. Ukraine is weak enough to accept what it previously rejected. The United States is ready to impose that outcome and absorb the political blame. And Russia judges that its core objectives are secure enough to trade further fighting for political consolidation. That deal will not match the rhetoric Western politicians have used for 2 years. It will not be just in Kyiv's sense. It will not restore borders. It will not bring Ukraine into NATO. Instead, it will formalize what Russian power has imposed on the ground. No amount of speeches in European parliaments will change that. No number of point plans written in Brussels conference rooms will alter what is already being written in blood and steel. What the Moscow talks and the subsequent debates have really exposed is not a path to a fair peace, but the death of the illusion that such a peace was ever on offer. The West gambled that it could bleed Russia into submission using Ukraine as a proxy. It lost. Russia adapted, endured, and prevailed. The only real question left is not whether Russia has won, it has, but how long Ukraine will be sacrificed before its Western patrons finally admit the truth and cut a deal that reflects the balance of power, not the fantasies of a bygone unipolar moment.